Aristotle, the man who taught the world how to think welcome. This is not just another story. This is a journey about a man who never wore a crown, but shaped kings. A man who never built armies, but trained the leader who conquered the world. A man who never invented machines, but invented the way we think about thinking. His name is Aristotle, a philosopher, a teacher, a mind so powerful that his words still live after 2,300 years. He taught Alexander the Great, but his influence went far beyond one king. His ideas became the foundation of science, logic, politics, biology, and education. They touched every corner of human thought. And yet, his life was not easy. He was not born into endless comfort. He was not always celebrated. He faced rejection, exile, heartbreak. There were times when Athens, the very city of knowledge, turned against him. But still, he wrote, he taught, he questioned, because for Aristotle, truth was more powerful than fear. Why should you listen to this story? Because maybe you also feel misunderstood. Maybe you also have ideas the world does not hear. Maybe you also dream of changing your life, not with weapons, but with words and wisdom. This story will not only teach you history, it will improve your English. You will practice listening, learn new words, and feel the rhythm of real storytelling. More importantly, you will see how one curious boy, born in a small town in northern Greece, became the teacher of the world. This is not just a biography, it is a mirror that shows you the power of asking questions, the courage of thinking differently, and the beauty of living with purpose. So sit back, breathe deeply, listen not only with your ears, but with your heart, because now begins the journey of Aristotle, the man who taught the world how to think. And our story starts with a boy who played not with toys, but with questions. The boy from Greece. Part 1, The Curious Boy from Greece. Let us travel back. Not 100 years, not 500, but more than 2,400 years ago. In a small town in northern Greece called Stagira, a baby was born in the year 384 BC. His name was Aristotle. His father was Nicomachus, a doctor. Not just any doctor. He served the king of Macedonia himself. That meant Aristotle grew up near people of power, near medicine, near knowledge. From his father, he learned something priceless: how to observe, how to ask, how to connect cause and effect. Other children played with toys. Aristotle played with questions. He looked at animals, clouds, plants. He asked, why does a bird fly? Why does the sun rise? He asked, what makes us happy? What is truth? Even as a child, his mind was not normal. He was born to look deeper, to wonder, to think. But life was not kind. When he was still a boy, tragedy came. Both his parents died. We don't know how, but we know the pain marked him forever. He became an orphan before he could even understand death. And yet, instead of breaking, he turned his pain into a question. Not why me, but what is life? What is death? Why are we here? Relatives raised him, and when he was old enough, they sent him to Athens, the heart of learning in the ancient world. Imagine this: you are 17 years old. You have lost your parents, and now you walk into a city filled with wisdom. At its center stood Plato's Academy, the first true university in history. And who was the master there? Plato himself, student of Socrates, the man who chose death rather than silence his truth. For Aristotle, this was heaven. He entered the academy as a student. He stayed not for 1 year, not for 10, but for 20 years. 20 years of listening, questioning, writing, debating. He became Plato's brightest student. But here's the interesting part. He didn't agree with everything. Plato taught about ideal forms, that the real world is just a shadow, that perfect versions of everything exist in another invisible realm. But Aristotle said, no, the truth is here, in what we see and touch. Plato said, there is a perfect tree somewhere else. Aristotle said, no, this tree right here, let's study it. He wanted to measure, to test, to observe. He began writing about everything: politics, animals, stars, happiness, the soul. His hand copied thousands of pages without electricity, without internet, only his brain and a scroll. Slowly, he was no longer just a student. He was becoming a force of knowledge. And yet, life tested him again. When Plato died, everyone thought Aristotle would lead the academy. 20 years of loyalty, 20 years of brilliance. But he was not chosen. Why? Because his ideas were too different, too scientific, too rebellious. He questioned too much. And so the academy closed its doors to him. It broke his heart. He lost his second home. But instead of falling into darkness, he walked away with fire in his mind. This was a turning point. When the world rejected him, he decided, if the academy will not listen, the world will. He began to travel, city to city, searching not for comfort, but for truth. His first stop was Assos, a city by the sea. There, a ruler named Hermias welcomed him. Hermias gave him a home, resources, freedom. Aristotle began teaching outdoors, under the sky. He told his students not just to imagine, but to look, to touch, to wonder. And in Assos, something unexpected happened. Aristotle, the great thinker, fell in love. He met Pythias, Hermias' adopted daughter. She was intelligent, curious, full of questions, just like him. They married, and later had a daughter, also named Pythias. Love softened him. He began to write not only about logic and science, but also about family, ethics, balance, and the good life. But happiness is never safe for long. The Persian Empire saw Hermias as a threat. They captured him, tortured him, killed him. Aristotle was devastated. His protector was gone. He wrote a hymn to honor Hermias, then once again moved on, this time to the island of Lesbos. There, near the sea, his mind turned to life itself. He studied fish, birds, insects. He dissected animals, watched how they moved, how they gave birth, how they died. He discovered that dolphins breathe air, that octopuses change color, that chicks form inside eggs. This was the birth of biology, not gods, not myths, but reality observed and recorded. No one had studied nature like this before, and yet destiny was preparing something even greater. In Macedonia, King Philip had a son, bold, restless, brilliant. His name was Alexander. The king wanted a teacher for his boy. He remembered Aristotle, the doctor's son, who had become the greatest living mind. He invited him, "Come to Macedonia, teach my son." And Aristotle said yes. This decision would change not only his life, but the history of the world. Part 2. Power, Politics, and the Price of Wisdom. When Aristotle arrived in Macedonia, he was welcomed with honor. King Philip II built a special school for him and his students, not in a palace, not on a battlefield, but in a quiet garden filled with trees, flowers, silence. This was no ordinary classroom. It was a place of nature where young men could learn not only to fight, but to think. And among those young men was Philip's son, a boy whose name would one day echo through history, Alexander. Aristotle's mission was not easy. Alexander was bold, restless, hungry for glory, but Aristotle gave him something his sword could not: wisdom. He taught him logic, politics, ethics, poetry, medicine, strategy. He taught him how to question, how to observe, how to reason. He told him, a true king does not only conquer, a true king must also understand. Aristotle gave Alexander a special gift, a copy of Homer's Iliad, with notes written in the margins by Aristotle's own hand. Alexander carried it with him for the rest of his life through battles, deserts, victories, defeats. It was more than a book. It was a guide, a silent teacher by his side. For several years, Aristotle shaped Alexander's mind, and when the boy grew into a man, he rode out to conquer the world. Persia fell. Egypt bowed. Armies marched east into Asia. In just over a decade, Alexander created the largest empire the world had ever seen. But behind the noise of swords and soldiers, there was always Aristotle's voice. His lessons on justice, discipline, and reason echoed in Alexander's ears. Wherever Alexander went, he sent back maps, plants, animals, so Aristotle could study them in Athens. Aristotle himself returned to Athens, not as a rejected student this time, but as the teacher of the most powerful man alive. Athens opened its arms. He founded his own school, the Lyceum. The Lyceum was different from Plato's academy. Plato's academy was filled with dreams and ideals. The Lyceum was filled with movement and observation. Aristotle and his students walked as they learned. That's why they were called peripatetics, the ones who walk around. They didn't just sit and imagine. They studied the real world. They collected laws from different cities, studied hundreds of animals, debated about ethics, memory, dreams, politics, and war. Aristotle wanted to understand everything, not just poetry or mathematics, but the whole of human life. His school became a machine of knowledge. One student measured the stars, another studied animals, another collected political systems. Aristotle himself wrote furiously. His works covered logic, ethics, biology, drama, psychology, physics, metaphysics. He wrote about friendship, about anger, about the soul. Some say he wrote over 200 works in his lifetime. His writing was not poetic. It was clear, dry, sharp, like blueprints of the human mind. This was his gift to the world, a structured way of thinking. Not just answers, but systems. Not just opinions, but logic. For a while, life seemed perfect. Aristotle was respected. His school was growing. His student ruled the known world. His influence reached from Athens to Asia. But history always tests greatness. Alexander began to change. He declared himself a god. He punished opponents with death. His rule grew harsher, more dangerous. And Athens watched with suspicion. They asked, is Aristotle advising him? Does he support tyranny? Is he loyal to Athens or to the empire? The same city that once rejected Aristotle now began to whisper against him again. He was not Athenian by birth. He had ties to Macedon. And when power shifted, suspicion grew. Then, in 323 BC, tragedy struck. Alexander the Great, just 32 years old, died suddenly in Babylon. The empire collapsed overnight. Chaos spread. In Athens, people celebrated. The tyrant was gone. But they didn't just celebrate Alexander's death. They turned their anger toward his teacher, toward Aristotle. Accusations rose. Impiety, disrespect for the gods, dangerous ideas. It didn't matter if they were true. In Athens, truth was not enough to protect you. Aristotle remembered what happened to Socrates, condemned to drink poison for corrupting the youth. He told his friends, "I will not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy." And quietly he left. Once again, the city he loved turned its back on him. He was in his 60s now. He had lost his school, his platform, his students. He carried only his books, his notes, and his thoughts. But he still carried something more powerful, a burning mind, a heart that refused to stop asking. The man who once taught kings and shaped empires was now in exile. But exile did not end him. It opened a new chapter. A chapter of deeper questions, a chapter of final truths. Part 3, Exile, Final Questions, and the Last Years. Aristotle left Athens quietly. He did not fight, he did not protest. He knew the city had once killed Socrates. He would not let it kill philosophy again. So he sailed across the sea to a town called Chalcis on the island of Euboea, where his mother had once lived. He was older now, in his 60s. His health was weaker. His legs were slower. But his mind was still burning. He had no school anymore, no eager students walking with him, no lyceum buzzing with debates, no royal connections, no political influence, only his books, only his notes, only his endless questions. And yet, even in exile, Aristotle kept writing. Every morning he woke early, sat at a simple wooden table, took his reed pen, and dipped it into black ink. His hands trembled. His body ached. But one sentence followed another, day after day, year after year, because he had one final mission: to make sure the truth would outlive him. He wrote about aging, about memory, about the soul, about the purpose of everything that exists. He believed every being has a cause, a purpose, a final form. And behind it all, he spoke of the unmoved mover, a force that causes everything, but is not moved by anything. Not a god with a beard, but a perfect mind, holding the order of the universe together. It was his quiet version of God, a vision not of temples, but of reason itself. At this time, Aristotle also had family. His beloved wife Pythias had died long ago, but he lived with Herpyllis, a woman he cared for deeply, and with their young son Nicomachus. Aristotle loved his boy. He spoke to him gently, told him stories, shared his thoughts as both philosopher and father. And so, when he began writing a great work on morality, he named it Nicomachean Ethics. Not because it was about his son, but because in that name, he left his heart. In this book, Aristotle explained, the good life is not about wealth, not about pleasure, not about power. The good life is about virtue, about courage, kindness, discipline, balance. He wrote, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. To him, happiness was not luck. Happiness was the result of daily choices, of small actions, of repeated character." Even as his own body weakened, he believed in strength of spirit. Even as exile silenced his voice, he believed in truth. But deep in his heart, there was a fear. He had written so much, hundreds of works, maybe more than 200. And yet, he knew the danger. Every word was on fragile scrolls, thin, dry material, easily destroyed by fire, water, or neglect. He worried, if just one generation fails to copy them, all my work will vanish. He didn't care about statues. He didn't want temples in his name. He wanted only one thing, that knowledge should survive, even if he did not. The seasons passed, winters grew longer, summers grew shorter. Aristotle's eyesight dimmed, his hands cramped, but he kept writing. He kept whispering questions to himself. He kept wrestling with ideas inside his mind, until finally, his strength ran out. In 322 BC, 1 year after Alexander's death, Aristotle closed his eyes for the last time. He was around 62 years old. He asked for a simple burial beside his first wife, Pythias. He asked that Herpyllis be cared for, that Nicomachus be educated, that his servants be freed and treated with dignity. No monuments, no grand ceremonies, just a quiet ending to a life of deep thought. And then, silence. The man who had taught kings, who had mapped the stars, who had named philosophy itself, was gone. After his death, chaos returned. Greece was unstable. His scrolls were scattered, hidden, forgotten. For nearly 200 years, the world acted as if Aristotle had never existed. The fire of his mind went dark, but not forever, because destiny was not finished. His words would rise again. His questions would travel across nations. His wisdom would shape empires yet to come. And that is where the next chapter begins. Part 4. The Philosopher Who Became Time. For almost 200 years after his death, the name Aristotle faded. His scrolls, fragile and forgotten, lay hidden in dusty cellars, in small villages, in secret corners of homes. The world moved on. Rome was rising. New philosophers spoke loudly, and slowly it was as if Aristotle had never lived. But truth has a strange power. It never dies completely. It waits silent until the right hands open it again. One day, in a city called Skepsis in Asia Minor, a wealthy book collector named Apellicon heard rumors. Rumors of lost scrolls, works of a great philosopher long forgotten. He searched, he paid, he bargained. And then he found them. Hundreds of scrolls, damaged, dusty, hard to read, but still alive. They were the writings of Aristotle, the forgotten treasure of human thought. Apellicon carried them back to Athens. Later, when the Roman general Sulla captured the city, the scrolls were taken to Rome. There, a young scholar named Andronicus of Rhodes began to study them. He did not just read. He organized. He edited. He sorted Aristotle's chaos into order. He gave us what we now know as the organon, the system of logic, the Nicomachean ethics, the guide to living well, the politics, how humans can live together, the poetics, how art reflects human truth, the metaphysics, the study of being itself, the history of animals, the birth of biology. These were not just books. They were the skeleton of human civilization. The intellectual foundation of everything to come. And still, Aristotle's journey was not finished. Centuries later, in the golden age of Islam, his works traveled again. In Baghdad, in Cairo, in Cordoba, scholars translated his writings into Arabic. They studied, debated, and expanded his ideas. Thinkers like Avicenna, Averroes, and Al-Farabi called him the first teacher. For them, Aristotle was not a Greek, not a stranger. He was universal, a guide for reason, for medicine, for astronomy, for law. From the Islamic world, his works returned once more to Europe, this time in Latin. At first, Christian scholars were suspicious. Aristotle was not Christian. He never spoke of the Bible. But one man, Thomas Aquinas, saw something different. He believed Aristotle's logic could strengthen faith, not weaken it. He combined reason with belief, and in doing so, he gave Aristotle a permanent place in European thought. For the next 600 years, students in Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, Bologna all studied Aristotle. They learned his logic to argue, his ethics to live, his politics to govern, his biology to explore nature. Even scientists who disagreed with him, Galileo, Newton, Kepler, still used his method of observation and reason. Even modern computer science, with its systems of classification and logic, can trace its roots back to Aristotle. His influence became so deep, so invisible, that people stopped noticing it. It was like the air we breathe, always there, shaping everything. Think about this. Aristotle lived before Jesus Christ, before the Roman Empire, before paper, before Islam, before telescopes, electricity, airplanes, satellites, smartphones. And yet, more than 2,300 years later, we are still asking his questions, still reading his words, still building our world on his foundation. What is happiness? What is truth? What is justice? What makes a good life? He never gave us final answers. He gave us tools. He taught us how to think. And that is why his wisdom feels fresh, not like old history, but like a mirror to modern life. In today's noisy world, where attention is short and fame is louder than wisdom, Aristotle is a lighthouse. He reminds us, quiet thinking is powerful. Truth takes patience. Discipline brings freedom. Greatness is not luck. It is habit, built day by day. And perhaps his most important lesson is this: even if the world forgets you, even if your voice is silenced, if your work is honest, your words are clear, and your purpose is pure, you will live forever. Aristotle's body turned to dust, but his mind became time-proof. His questions became eternal. He did not conquer cities. He conquered ignorance. He did not build empires of land. He built an empire of reason. And today, whether you realize it or not, you are living in the world Aristotle helped build. The legacy lives in you. More than 2,300 years ago, a boy lay under the stars of Greece. He asked simple questions. Why am I here? What is truth? What is a good life? That boy became Aristotle. He never led an army. He never wore a crown. He never ruled a nation. But he shaped kings. He built systems. He planted seeds of knowledge that grew into the forest of our modern world. He was forgotten once, almost erased from history. But truth has patience, and because he wrote with honesty, his words survived storms, exiles, wars, centuries. Aristotle reminds us of something vital, that greatness is not in birth, not in wealth, not in applause. Greatness is in questions, in courage, in habits repeated every day, in the choice to seek wisdom over comfort. And so, this is not just the end of a story. It is the beginning of a mindset that whispers, ask more, think deeper, live with balance, practice virtue, become better each day, learn something new every moment, and never stop searching for truth. If you carry that mindset, then Aristotle is not just a figure of the past. He becomes your teacher, your guide, your companion in thought. And now it is your turn. Your turn to read, to listen, to question, to grow. Your turn to shape not only your own life, but the lives of those who will come after you. Because the legacy of Aristotle is not in statues or scrolls. It is in the minds of those who keep thinking. And right now, that includes you. So if this story touched you, if you learned something new today, if you felt a spark of wisdom inside your heart, do one simple thing. Subscribe to the channel, because we are just beginning. The next story may inspire you even more than this one did. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and above all, never stop thinking.